War to most is about guns, bombs, blood, and trenches. But what if I told you that some of the most powerful weapons in World War II were paint, sound effects, and rubber tanks? That instead of bullets, there were brush strokes. Instead of soldiers, there were artists and actors. This is the true little-known story of the Ghost Army, a secret American unit whose entire mission was deception, and who helped turn the tide of the war not with force but with pure creativity. It was officially called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a name bland enough to keep curious minds away. But its members? They were anything but ordinary. Handpicked from art schools, advertising agencies, fashion studios, and even Broadway stages, these 1,100 men were not hardened soldiers. They were painters, sculptors, sound engineers, set designers, radio operators, and illustrators. Before the war, they were designing magazine covers, painting portraits, or setting up lighting on theater productions. During the war, they became masters of illusion on a scale the world had never seen. The Ghost Army NDS mission was both simple and mind-bendingly complex: to fool the Germans into believing US troops were where they weren't, and not where they were. That meant impersonating entire divisions, up to 30,000 men, with just a handful of people. They created phantom armies complete with fake vehicles, scripted radio chatter, and soundscapes so convincing that enemy reconnaissance planes and spies believed them to be real. It was a performance, an elaborate moving theater of war, and it saved countless lives. Let's start with their props: inflatable tanks, rubber artillery, fake jeeps, and airplanes made of canvas and wood. These weren't toys. They were full-scale replicas that, from the sky or a distance, looked indistinguishable from the real thing. A field might be empty one day and filled with tanks the next, thanks to a few hours of inflating rubber replicas. The Germans, watching from the skies, would shift their troops accordingly, reacting to shadows and illusions. But it didn't stop at visuals. One of the Ghost Army's most powerful weapons was sound. Enter the 3102nd Signal Service Company. These men created mobile sound units mounted on half-tracks. Think giant speakers on wheels. They recorded and remixed the noises of tanks rumbling, soldiers marching, and engineers constructing bridges. These audio illusions could be blasted up to 15 miles away. At night, in the misty European countryside, the sound of an entire armored division setting up camp could fill a valley, when in reality, it was just a few guys with a speaker system and a lot of imagination. Then there was the radio deception, known as spoof radio. Specialized operators mimicked the chatter of real units, copying their mannerisms and communication styles. Every division had its quirks: how it signed off, what codes it used, the cadence of its messages. Ghost Army radio men studied these patterns and imitated them perfectly. Meanwhile, the real units moved silently, unnoticed, into position somewhere else. Their deception had to be comprehensive. Artists hand-painted phony insignia on uniforms. Jeeps were marked with fake unit numbers. Even the soldiers themselves were trained to play the part, casually talking in pubs about their division or leaving misleading hints for spies. Everything from mud patterns on boots to the way tents were pitched was crafted to make their illusion believable. One of their most dramatic operations was Operation Brest in August 1944. The U.S. Army wanted to encircle German forces holding out in the French port city of Brest. The Ghost Army set up just to the north of the city, pretending to be the 6th Armored Division. Over the course of several days, they inflated dummy tanks, blared the sounds of a moving army, and mimicked radio communications. The Germans took the bait, holding their positions to face a phantom army while the real one flanked them from the south. Perhaps their greatest achievement came during Operation Viersen in March 1945, just before the Allies crossed the Rhine River into Germany. The Ghost Army impersonated 2 entire divisions, setting up more than 600 inflatable tanks and vehicles, producing a massive sound show, and broadcasting fake radio traffic. They even created dummy artillery flashes with strobe lights. German forces were completely fooled, redirecting their attention away from the actual crossing point. Historians estimate that this operation alone may have saved between 15,000 and 30,000 lives. And all of it, every tank, every sound, every message, was a lie. But what made the Ghost Army so unique wasn't just their tactics, it was the spirit behind them. These men knew they were risking everything, often operating just a few miles from enemy lines with no real weapons. If they were discovered, they would be slaughtered. They weren't just artists anymore. They were actors on the deadliest stage imaginable, performing not for applause but for the chance to save others. They also documented everything. Many of the soldiers kept sketchbooks and journals. One soldier, Arthur Singer, who later became a famous wildlife illustrator, sketched scenes of bombed-out villages and army camps, often adding a touch of humor or surrealism. Bill Blass, who would go on to become a fashion icon, designed camouflage uniforms and fake division patches. Others would later write about the strangeness of their mission, how they were surrounded by death and destruction, yet creating art and theater in the midst of it. For decades, their work remained top secret. Even their families didn't know the full extent of what they had done. It wasn't until 1996 that the U.S. Army officially declassified the Ghost Army's operations. By then, many of its members had passed away, their heroic acts still unknown to the world. But their impact was massive. According to military analysts, the Ghost Army carried out more than 20 deception missions in Europe between 1944 and 1945. At times, they were the only unit on the front lines, not with rifles but with illusions. They gave the Allies a strategic advantage and threw German intelligence into disarray. Most importantly, they saved lives, thousands of them. In 2022, after years of campaigning, the members of the Ghost Army were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest honors the U.S. can bestow. It was a long overdue recognition for men who had spent decades in silence, carrying a legacy of invisible heroism. The story of the Ghost Army is more than a military tale. It is a tribute to the power of creativity, to the idea that imagination can be just as lethal, just as decisive as any weapon. In a war defined by brute force, these artists proved that brains could beat brawn, and that sometimes the greatest warriors aren't the ones who pull the trigger, but the ones who make the enemy believe the gun is somewhere else. So next time you think of World War II, don't just picture storming beaches or tanks rolling across Europe. Picture a group of artists in muddy boots, crouched behind an inflatable Sherman tank, whispering into a radio, and praying that their performance would hold long enough to fool the enemy. They weren't ghosts in the supernatural sense, but for the Germans, their presence was hauntingly real. And for the rest of us, their legacy is a reminder. Sometimes the most powerful forces in war are the ones that never fire a shot.